Hello, beautiful community. Happy Sunday. Today we are doing a longish episode. We'll do a reading of a piece about Russia's scary informational war against us, the state of our informational environment, and what we might do to make the situation better and what we might avoid doing to make the situation worse. And we'll do this by reading a piece by Garner in Foreign Policy. Titled, now authors are not typically responsible for titles their pieces get, "The West is still oblivious to Russia's informational war, paralyzed by free speech concerns, Western governments are loath to act." Many of you will know Ian from his book The Z Generation, and we'll put the name of the book down below our video and a link to the foreign policy article as well. But let's ground ourselves first a little bit, as we like to do on this channel first, before the reading. Experts are sacred, right? We're going to be reading a piece by an expert, and experts are sacred. They're not sacred because they're right, or they're thinking in the right way about the challenges we face, or because they agree with you or me. They're sacred because expertise, often academic expertise, is in of itself a central counter-majoritarian institution in a democracy. You lose it, and it's a bit like losing the courts or losing another counter-majoritarian institutions. You don't get democracy. You get a society that is untethered from the practiced virtue of truthfulness, and a society like that can't sustain itself democratically. So we've got to ask a lot of experts. They shouldn't be assessed, they should stay in their lane, but at the same time we are screwed without them, and so there is a sacredness to them, and we have to feel that a little bit. The second thing I think we've got to feel is that our informational space is sacred, because on it is also dependent the sustenance of our discourse and the sustenance of our public squares, and in the end the sustenance of our democracy. That feels hard, and that even feels wrong to you when I say it, because why are you telling me to treat sacred what feels to me on a daily basis like a kind of ill-assorted cesspool of darkness? It's precisely because that our public squares, our informational environment is in such a bad way, they've got to be very, very gentle about how we think about it, how we talk about it, and how we try to make it better. And I understand a tendency to kind of lash out at it and maybe even throw a couple of poison arrows just into it, because it all just feels so intimidating and sometimes even unintelligible. Don't do that. If you do that, don't beat yourself up for it. Reflect on it. Reflect on how that expresses your character, who you want to be, how you want to lead your life. And don't beat yourself too much for partaking in some of the destructive dynamics that you encounter on the internet. And also know that sometimes you might really, really beat yourself up for partaking in such dynamics. And then you've got to be gentle on yourself, and gentle on the part of you that doesn't want to be gentle with yourself. So that's a little bit of a grounding before we jump in. So what are we jumping into, really? Well, I haven't read Ian's piece yet. I've just had a cursory look at it. And it seems like it's a long discussion with a couple of practical suggestions, practical tips that we'll come to at the end. But we've got to appreciate that we are living in a political moment in which our debates about the state of our information environment are themselves part of our culture wars. And that our disagreements and our conflicts about the impact of malign foreign interference on our discourse, that itself is part of our culture wars. And our culture wars are deep. We are experiencing a level of polarization through which we're beginning to relate to one another in our own societies, whether you're in France and in Canada, in Australia, we're beginning to relate to each other not as opponents but as enemies. So we're living in a dynamic in which we risk seeing each other as enemies, and in which our very conversation about the state of our informational environment and our very evaluation of the extent of malign foreign interference in our democracies by the Chinese or by the Russians will be the topic today, that itself is mobilized and instrumentalized in our domestic culture wars. And then when it comes to Ian's solutions, we're going to see what Ian proposes. But one of the paradoxes we have is this situation of trying to pull ourselves out of the water without having anything to reach for, because we are living through a crisis of trust in which we're going to have to ask institutions that have themselves lost trust to take measures to mitigate the loss of trust. Okay, enough. Let's start. I am going to probably skip evidence giving and explanations and elaborations from time to time. So we might end up reading 60-70% of Ian's article. And I don't know how we'll go. Either I'll give a bit of analysis as we go along, or at the end. Ian, a few weeks ago, a Russian autocrat addressed millions of Western citizens in a propaganda event that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Yet, it's so normal today as to almost be unremarkable. Tucker Carlson's interview with the Russian non-president, that's me, Vladimir Putin, has now been viewed more than 120 million times on YouTube, on X, formerly known as Twitter. Despite the tedium of Putin's 2-hour-long lecture about an imaginary Russian and Ukrainian history, the streaming and promotion of the interview by Western platforms is only the latest successful foray into Russia's information war against the West, which Moscow is showing every sign of winning. Look at that. So Ian's going gung-ho in the first paragraph, which Moscow is showing every sign of winning. Well, quite certainly we can say that they are waging an information war on us. We might say a bit more about it as we go along. And they are trying to win it, right? Then comes a conversation about the impact relative to the commotion they generate, and impact relative to their desire to make an impact, and we can talk about that. And Ian is being alarmist here, and perhaps that's reasonable. And in this war, the Kremlin isn't just weaponizing social media, but relying on Westerners themselves to spread its message far and wide. A decade into Russia's all-out informational war, social media companies seem to have forgotten their promises to act after the 2016 US presidential election interference scandal. And again, here we must recognize that the interference occurred. We must, having said that, then have a conversation about its efficacy. When Russian-sponsored posts reach 126 million Americans on Facebook alone, policymakers not only seem oblivious to the full breadth and scope of Russia's information war, but fears about stifling freedom of speech and contributing to political polarization. We'll get to that, I'm sure, in more detail, have led them and the social media companies to largely refrain from any action to stop Russia's ongoing campaign. Now, of course, we're talking about ourselves here, while what some of us might argue are our public squares, of which this is one, are in the hands of potato chip companies. That's to say, there is a question about the political legitimacy of how our public squares are regulated and curated. We often debate what is the best way to curate them, what is the best way for YouTube to organize its algorithm, for example. But an even more basic question is, could anything that YouTube does be perceived actually as more legitimate than what my corner a vegetable store would do if we asked it to moderate this public square? This inaction, Ian says, comes amid growing signs of Russian influence operations that have deeply penetrated Western politics and society. Dozens, if not hundreds or more, of Russian agents have been observed everywhere from English towns to Canadian universities. Many of these agents are low level and appear to achieve little individually, but occasionally they penetrate institutions, companies, and governments. I'm going to skip a couple of sentences. For many decades, Western societies have been deluged with every sort of influence imaginable. While there have been some countermeasures since the start of Russia's latest war, including in the US and the EU, shutting off access to Russian media networks such as RT and Sputnik in early 22, these small ineffective steps are the equivalent of information war virtue signaling. They do not fundamentally change Western governments' lack of any coherent approach to the many vectors of Russian disinformation and hybrid warfare. So we often talk about a lack of Western strategy on the military front and on the front of the issue of the politicization of the Russian space and a strategic approach to questions of European security and security in Eastern Europe and security in the ex-Soviet space. And we talk about why that's so and how that might be linked to what we call our democratic incapacity. But here Ian is saying we also have a strategy challenge, a strategy deficit in the info war. Ian, at the very moment when Kremlin narratives on social media are beginning to seriously undermine support for Ukraine, Western governments' handle on the disinformation crisis seems to be getting weaker by the day. So let's take a preliminary interlude here and layer two things onto each other. One is the information crisis. The other is the crisis of trust. As you know, I believe that the information crisis we face sits atop a more fundamental challenge, which is our crisis of trust. I call it the biggest crisis of trust in public institutions since the European revolutions of 1848. And you guys, if you're regular here, are bored to infinity with my repeating something like a sort of 4+4 model. 4 social forces of democratic degeneration, 4 psychologies of diminution of trust, right? So the 4 social forces are roughly, I mean, they're just placeholders, but are roughly the untethering of communal bonds through various political and economic forces of diffusion, right? Communities pulled apart, families pulled apart, a great deal of mobility and so on. Number one. Number two, of course, the state of the internet, which is where you and I are engaging right now. Number 3, various mechanisms of systemic exclusion. And number 4, ideologies of psychic self-realization. that emphasize authenticity or even certain distortions of the value of authenticity at the expense of solidarity and the public good. The psychic mirror of this in 4 steps is that, least importantly, people feel unsafe with their public institutions because they feel that they're incompetently run. Then, more worryingly, people feel powerless. They feel there is no way to inflect the political process around them. Then people feel betrayed, right? We're getting closer into the heart of the challenges of polarization here. People feel that political representatives who they disagree with in their country aren't just opponents but are enemies and are positively evil, right? So betrayal. And the worst of all emotions is this feeling of finding your political institutions, all your public institutions, indeed even public health institutions, opaque. When you look at them and it don't make any sense what you're seeing. You're looking at an ill-assorted game of sport where 4 or 5 games are being played, and it's a flurry of baseball bats, cricket bats, footballs, and you can't make heads or tails of it. And the instinct you get is an instinct toward destruction. Well, let's get rid of this thing if it is so disturbingly unintelligible. And very often, when we accuse fellow citizens of being victims of disinformation, it's both true that we might be right that they're peddling half-truths or untruths, but it's also the case that they are responsive to a deep crisis of trust. And perhaps on top of this 4+4 model, let's add a point about agency. A lot of people feel that what you and I might cast as a truthful picture of our societies is so oppressive to them that it just extinguishes political agency, their sense of political agency. So that's to say, it's not that people are dumb and they need to wise up and they need to stop falling for bad disinformation. We need to debate how far that in itself is a useful thing to say. It is to some extent. It's rather that we're living in a social moment in which there is a conflict between tens of millions of citizens' sense of political agency and truth. And if we say that that's a genuine social conflict, it's not just a matter of a few Trump voters being ignorant, then we can't just say that all that's wrong here is irrationality or poor information. So you see how everything we've just very caricaturally put on the canvas suggests a different emphasis, right, to a line which says disinformation just means people are making cognitive errors, they're not thinking clearly, they're brainwashed and so on, right? We're talking about people experiencing real political emotions that are understandable in many ways, that aren't mere intellectual errors, and these produce a situation where certain pictures of their society that other citizens insist on, that they might be often true, are just unpalatable to them. They feel it would be a kind of political self-immolation to buy into it, right? So underneath the crisis of disinformation, we have a crisis of trust. For Putin's Russia, information psychological warfare, as a Russian military textbook called it, is intended to erode the morale and psychological spirit of an enemy population. Ian elaborates, and I invite you to read the piece if you want to read every sentence. Let's go on. Moscow launches its attacks using a playbook similar, familiar to anyone who watched the disinformation campaigns linked to the 2014 invasion of Crimea and the 2016 presidential election. Bots, trolls, targeted ad campaigns, fake news organizations, and doppelganger accounts of real Western politicians and pundits spread stories concocted in Moscow or in Petersburg, where the Wagner group leader Prigozhin ran an army of trolls. Skipping a little more. What is undoubtedly new is a polarized Western public's enthusiasm for recentering its own identity around Moscow's narratives and becoming an unwitting weapon in the information war. Take QAnon, for instance, and here Ian elaborates, and we skip. While ordinary users are certain that they're merely speaking their minds, a domestic policy issue has ultimately turned into a vehicle for Moscow to exert influence over national security decisions. Such phenomena are all too familiar, whether they relate to the US presidential election influence scandal, we've just skipped a couple of sentences again, to the constant reiteration of Moscow's talking points about NATO, or to the web of useful idiots, from quasi-journalists to rappers who seem to function as mouthpieces for the Kremlin by consistently spreading favorable narratives under the guise of asking questions or presenting two sides of the story. We're just having a conversation, man. It's an exchange of ideas, man. Dave Rubin. Moscow also exploits non-Western networks such as Telegram, TikTok to its own advantage. And here Ian is elaborating a bit on TikTok. Now, let's make a couple of remarks briefly. It's quite standard of the Russians that what they're into is not seeding new conflicts, but taking a look at what conflicts already animate us and trying to make them worse via sort of oversaturation of the informational environment by sort of ill-assorted messages that destructively appeal in various ways to different groups. This raises a very, very important question about measuring impact. And whatever views you take of measuring impact, it's very important that there are no obvious answers to it. It's not easy to measure such impact because the conflicts we're dealing with are organic to our societies typically. And so have the Russians exaggerated conflict X by, trivially speaking, 0.1%, or by 1.1%, or by 71%? You've got to go slow here. And why do we want to go slow here? We want to go slow here because the terminus here is back to polarization, right? That's to say, treating other people in our society as enemies because they are, if you like, soldiers, right, of the mission of malign foreign interference, right, emanating out of this maniacal, destructive and self-destructing empire in Moscow. Hang on, I'm just getting a telephone call on my highlighter here. Hello? Oh, you're reporting on the beautiful community. Yep, I'm here, listening. It's 2.3. Okay, I'm going to jot that down. So 2.3% of them with a NAFO tag in their Twitter account today called the Pope a Russian asset. Okay. It's a repeat offense for many of them, and it's 2.3%. Well, the Pope does show an impoverished understanding of the conflict, but I do think that that's a worry, them calling him a Russian asset. I recommend, unfortunately, I think 30 minutes of the Naughty Step for that 2.3%. What can they do? They can read Aristotle. 30 minutes of Aristotle on the naughty step for the 2.3. All right? Thank you. Sorry, just had to take that call. I normally don't like interrupting our conversations. I know it's incredibly rude. Ian, even when they I must have lost track of some point I was making before. Doesn't matter. We're going in circles sufficiently that we're covering enough. Even when they ostensibly have more control, US policymakers have been unwilling to do much to stem the tide of pro-Russian propaganda. Since Musk took over Twitter and renamed it X, the network has all but openly welcomed Russian influence campaigners into its servers. The platform even hosts Kremlin-aligned neo-fascists such as Alexander Dugin. And then, let's skip a sentence. X's streaming and promotion of the Tucker Carlson interview and Musk's own echoing of Russian talking points, such as highly specific claims about Ukraine using phrasing normally employed only by Russian officials, have come in for heavy criticism. But just as damaging are the smaller communities created around figures like Dugin, where Western users do much to spread an anti-Ukraine message. Well, here Ian is making a gambit in a conversation about how we might filter and regulate our public squares. Of course, it's an extremely difficult conversation because, as we've just mentioned a few minutes ago, we've got this crisis of legitimacy about the fact that these are potato chip companies, which we're asking to regulate better a vital democratic space of ours. And we're dealing with algorithms that are untransparent, which is also a very, very big problem. There's a real conversation about how to make the algorithms transparent. And we're dealing with a world in which each country has its own free speech culture. Germany's free speech culture is very different to US free speech culture. What you could get civic consent for in Germany around what constitutes responsible speech is very different to what you could get civic consent for in the United States. But we may or may not come back to Dugin specifically. Yet despite abundant, we've skipped a paragraph now, examples of Russian narrative showing up in Western debates, there is almost no serious discussion within governments or among the public about how to end Russia's information war in the West. Let's skip a bit. When Western governments do address foreign hybrid threats, such as cybersecurity and election interference, they are increasingly also focused on China and insufficiently focused on Russia. Skipping a bit more. Any Western vision for future peace in Ukraine and any discussion of a return to business as usual with Russia must be paired with restrictions on Russian interference and influence in Western daily life. Ukraine, which has been actively battling Russian influence as part of its war since 2014, has already developed approaches from which the West could learn. First, okay, so we're going to get some practical suggestions here. Ukraine has taken to heart that information is a weapon that Russia is using against the West. As Ihos Solovey, head of Ukraine's Center for Strategic Communication and Information Security, put it in Foreign Policy. The West, too, Ian says, must reframe Russia's disinformation campaigns and other influence activities in the language of war. The West, too, must refrain Russia's disinformation campaigns and other influence activities in the language of war. that, I think, is a normatively impeccable proposal. The trouble with it in practice is, of course, that we are increasingly seeing each other as enemies. And understanding why that's happening is absolutely central. And understanding how far that is a product of malign foreign interference is itself absolutely central. Is toxic polarization in the West 1% a product of malign foreign interference, or 10% a product of such interference? That makes a universe of difference. And they've got to work that out together while being engaged in this toxic polarization, being caught up in this toxic polarization. So there is absolutely value in this categorization, but it also comes with dangers. And we might as well mention that the shovel we have to help ourselves in this situation is a shovel that's losing trust. And so to some extent, trying to get institutions to take action here will be effective. To some extent, it'll be a matter of digging ourselves only deeper into a hole with that shovel while trying to fix the hole. And we've got to make sure it's more of the first and less of the second. But that danger is always there, because we have got a crisis of trust in institutions, and we're appealing to institutions to fix the crisis of trust. Second, Western policy makers must act in concert, forming a coalition analogous to the Rammstein group that coordinates military aid to Ukraine, to pass laws and other measures to ensure that Russia is not able to feed its information directly to Western citizens through social media. And here I'm especially grateful to Ian, because we need experts to attend to our informational environment. And I always want to elevate experts who are constructively making us attend to this and attend to all the dangers the state of our informational environment presents, because that goes to the heart of the challenges we face. I think on that table behind me, there's a couple of copies of Peter Pomerantsev's latest book, also on information warfare. So we've got to really be grateful to everybody who's helping us engage in this constructively. Although, Ian goes on, citizens should be free to discuss any stories they like, enemy combatants should not have the right to free speech in the West. That means that figures such as the ultranationalist Dugin should not be welcome on Western social media. The platforms should be threatened with paralyzing penalties for allowing Moscow's propaganda to spread. Do we legislate the Dugin example? There's plenty of stuff that Dugin says that in of itself doesn't pass an elementary test. That test is that you can't threaten violence, and Dugin has threatened violence. And he has engaged in arguably, that is my view, genocidal discourse. Of course, Dugin also has a lot of interesting things to say about the very thing we're talking about. In other words, if you get Hillary Clinton to talk about the crisis of trust we face in the West, and you get Dugin to talk about it, we're going to learn more about the problems we face and the solutions we need from Dugin than from Hillary Clinton. He has a very much superior intuitive hold, for instance, on what motivates Western citizens to give up, to lose trust, than Hillary, or at least the Hillary since 2016 would. So what I'll do is simply not legislate on this, because I think that could take us into a 10-minute conversation where we have to weigh what would happen to Dugin. So I'm just gonna go with Ian on this for the purpose of this talk. Next, the US State Department's recently released framework for combating disinformation falls far short in this regard. When Moscow is already fighting its hybrid war deep inside Western societies, restricting Moscow's access to social media portals is an urgent and essential act of national defense. The time for vague plans, investigations, and reports is over. It is time to use the West's superior technical capacity to ensure that no Russian bots, trolls, or fake accounts are able to access X, Facebook, and other platforms. Let's go on. Finally, so there is a third point of practical application Ian's making. Western governments must move beyond ineffective fact-checking to embark on a mass program of civic education through schools, universities, and public advertising. Okay. Now, civic education takes very different forms, but quite certainly civic education about negotiating the information environment is very, very important. And though we sometimes ourselves name that end, a lot of the activity we engage in, you and I engage in, especially here on the second channel, is something that's not too far from an exploration of what our civic education needs might be and how to take forward steps into them, into making progress on this. And that's, of course, partly a feature of the fact that here on the chat channel, we simply throw the algorithm out of the window. We do not have any interest in more people watching these videos. That's been my approach so far. So what we've had is a community that's quite limited. Perhaps it's worth saying a little bit about who we are, as this is a conversation about the information environment. We've got a community that's quite delimited and doesn't really grow much, except when some people come over from the main channel. And the whole point is not reach, but a relatively limited group of people returning and returning and returning and returning to the same room to have a discussion that isn't about a particular view of the world being pushed, but about questions being asked about how we might look at what's around us better, make sense of it better, how we might square truthfulness and hopefulness, how we might go on making sense of things, making sense of the world without being broken by it, and so on. Let's do a quick note about who we are, I suppose. So we are in a kind of algorithmic ecosystem here, undoubtedly. I mean, you're just not likely to be recommended a Tucker Carlson video after me, right? So we are in a certain kind of algorithmic space. In it, we are older. So I am 42. Here, most of the audience is a little older than me. A slight majority is over 45 here, and we have plenty of over 65s watching this too. We are mostly North American and European. We are disproportionately tilted toward having degrees, and quite a few of you have PhDs. Very disproportionate percentage, especially for the second channel here. That's true. We take the climate crisis very seriously, and we're broadly enormously sympathetic to Ukraine, and indeed preponderantly conscious that we are currently in a kind of strategic stasis when it comes to Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. So that says a little bit about where we're at. So we're a very particular group. You're not representative of everyone in your society. You're not representative of the majority of people in your society. And in this algorithmic bubble, you're clearly going to be protected from exposure to certain things, and you're going to over-index on exposure to certain other things, blah, 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 blah. A little bit about us. As the group extends, the repeat audience on the main channel perhaps is quite a bit bigger, historically maybe toward 250,000, and then that evens out and more people of various kinds come in. But what I've described is the core audience, the few tens of thousands keep coming back and coming back. Let's go on. Civic education for Ian. Okay, such a program should relentlessly emphasize the threat that Russia's interference poses. Clearly label it as an ongoing war and give it the public tools and give the public tools for understanding and countering Russian attacks in their varied forms. But here again we run into this problem that we're going to pull ourselves out of the water without having anything to hold on to, because we're ourselves in a toxic conflict about what constitutes and what does not constitute Russian influence in our society. And this is weaponized, right? That's to say, people on a side that in many ways we might find sympathetic themselves also weaponize this, right? Let's take an example of somebody you overwhelmingly admire, Tim Snyder. Tim Snyder regularly says that Russian interference played a significant role in swinging the election toward Trump in 2016. Right? I do not think that is something that one can say while in that instance being a responsible public intellectual. Right? In part because of the inconclusiveness of the evidence around impact, but even more importantly, you are generating conspiracy theories, right, potentially, which as it were outsource organic domestic conflict as though it were preponderantly a product of malign foreign interference, thereby deepening the crisis of trust, thereby deepening the polarization, and thereby treating the crisis of agency that many voters are experiencing as though it were a product either of malign foreign interference or irrationality. That's the risk, right? That's the risk. And so we're all in danger of instrumentalization and mobilization of this, right? So how do we transcend this? One approach might be to focus not on Russia's attack on us, which is absolutely real in civic education, but on how to negotiate the information environment no matter who is attacking us. Right? We're not necessarily contradicting what Ian has written. A recent Canadian government campaign was a good start, but framed disinformation as a vague threat that hides well, rather than exposing it as the tool of a foreign government attacking Western societies. It's very important, I think, to Ian to say, no, we've got to name it as the Russians. We've got to see exactly what the Russians are doing, what it looks like, and we should get better at seeing it when it's there in broad daylight. Ukraine's program of anti-disinformation education has proved robust and could serve as a model. Of course, some Western citizens could still choose to access Russian propaganda through non-Western services. A truly bold government would respond to the Russian threat not just defensively but in kind by flooding pro-Russian channels on Telegram with Western messaging and establishing other channels that subtly spread anti-Russian narratives. I think Ian is actually making a very important point here. We're not doing this. Part of the reason we're not doing this is that we still talk about this conflict between democracy and authoritarianism, but we kind of realize that as the post-1989 global order is melting down, we made a video about this on the main channel, we're becoming shy to talk about it in terms of a battle between authoritarianism and democracy, and indeed, in many ways, shy for good reasons. It's often naive to still conceive the world in that way, and we're uncomfortable to do some of what they're doing to us, to them, and we haven't even conceived of what that would look like. But I think conceiving what it would look like in practice, right, and flooding their information environment is very important. And we can start here with something that's a little bit less highfalutin, a little bit less pompous than this conflict between authoritarianism and democracy, by asking a very basic question. Is there any human on earth for whom democracy and the modicum of political liberty that comes with is inappropriate as a social form? And my answer to that would be no. Right? And then we can start building from that. Ian, when Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, the Kremlin spent millions of dollars on trolls to spread its messaging online. For Putin, the money was well spent. Since then, Russia's approach has been constantly refined, reaching deeply into electoral processes and public debates, ultimately affecting decisions about how and whether to aid Ukraine. But we need to assess impact, right? Not just how much they tried and how much commotion they generated. Yet Western policymakers are still letting themselves be caught on the back foot because they either do not or will not confront the reality that the Kremlin is waging a war on the West in which all citizens are already a part. Resolving this problem will require bold and potentially unpopular action. So here, unpopular action raises an alarm, because one of the things that we do not want to do is deepen the crisis of trust we are in while trying to solve it. And we would deepen the crisis of trust if we were licentious and simply told citizens who are misinformed to shut up and to wise up, because that political asphyxiation they're feeling, we would treat as simple error or simple sort of naive immersion in enterprises of malign foreign interference, not a product of an overwhelmingly domestic crisis of trust, right? So we need to balance the domestic crisis of trust that we're somewhat drowning in with these genuinely dangerous ongoing enterprises of interference. Let's make no mistake about this. Since 2014, it has essentially been the proper policy of the Kremlin to destabilize Western democracies. And I think there's a paragraph here from Ian, which either I haven't read or I've read and forgotten. Let's read it again in case I didn't read it. In fact, we may have missed it, so let's do it. As we enter the third year, sorry to go back, but this is really important. The third year of Russia's attempt to conquer Ukraine, has become apparent that the Kremlin's information war is fully integrated into the military one. Some of that is aimed at Ukraine, with Russian disinformation campaigns attempting to sow distrust there. But for the Kremlin, the information war against the West is key. Ian continues, that's because Putin's theory of victory in Ukraine runs through Western capitals. And of course, you know that I deeply agree with that analysis if you're regular here. If Western support can be undermined over time, Kiev will lack the weapons and resources to keep fighting. The war over Western opinions, therefore, at least as existential for Putin as the fight on the ground in Ukraine. Putin's theory of victory is Western decline, and Putin's view of Western decline, and quite frankly, the view of the Kovalchuk brothers, the view of Patrushev, the view of a handful plus of people around Putin, is a kind of Fukuyamianism in reverse, as I call it. That's to say, they don't just think that we have a crisis of trust and democratic decline, as I, in historical terms, outline. They believe that we are facing imminent democratic collapse, inexorably so. And that's because history can't sustain the charade that we are trying to insist on being a genuine political enterprise. That's to say, all of our fluff about democracy is just going to be washed away by history. It's not real, it's ephemeral. So Western democratic collapse is inevitable, and it's a matter of time. So they see our decline not as a genuine crisis, which it is, but as a kind of almost, historically teleological dogma. Yeah. So that's why I think Ian is saying something really important and true when he says that their theory of victory runs through our capitals. Final remark from Ian: as AI and other technologies make the dissemination of messaging to Western audiences even easier, this is going to get worse. It's time for Western governments to act, otherwise Moscow will win not only militarily, but a hybrid war as well, right? Moscow will win not only a military war in Ukraine, but a hybrid one across the West. So let me make one final remark that might be not as central as the other things I've said, rather than just repeating all the little interventions I made. And that might be a remark about algorithmic thought. Algorithmic thought is when what we react to is, and this is also an important part of civic education, is when we react to not the meaning of what's said, but to the surface of it and to the signals that come with it. So we hear the word Navalny, our reaction is Assange. We hear the word Navalny, our reaction is sandwich. And we are reacting to slogans with slogans, and are ourselves in this sort of rather binary dynamic that mirrors the workings of the current algorithms on social media platforms. And that is destructive upon free thought. Nobody, with a very few exceptions of people in weird jobs, sometimes it might be true of philosophers, nobody has a duty to think originally, but we all have a duty to think for ourselves and to think freely as much as we can. And the algorithmification of thought, right, is a danger that threatens us. And we've got to be careful about it because, of course, we are easily persuaded that the best way to react to the ghastly Kremlin algorithmification of thought. Somebody mentions Ukraine, and then the phrase comes out, "Where were you 8 years in the Donbass? When 8 years of bombing in the Donbass?" And that is so oft repeated in the Russian propaganda space that they often even get the words and the syllables of the word the wrong way around because it's said so quickly. We don't want to do that ourselves. And one way in which a lot of us have persuaded ourselves to take on Russian propaganda is to ourselves engage in various sort of algorithmic sloganized patterns of interaction that are of questionable efficacy and above all are not democratically substantial, right? So we don't want to debunk vile and truthful slogans with other slogans, which might be less untruthful and less vile. What we want is to engage in a way that is conducive to a public conversation that involves all of us, that keeps as many Western citizens at the table as possible, and that invites us to some microscopic bits of progress in the realm of imagination and strategic thought toward the challenges we face. So just an inarticulate micro rant from me here on the dangers of algorithmic thought. But the core of what we've talked about here is Ian's very important warning about the dangers to our information environment, and my addition of a footnote of importance here, which is that the crisis of disinformation is deep down, to a large extent at least, reducible to an organic crisis of trust that's threatening our democracies, which quite certainly, to whatever extent we still need to debate, the Kremlin is trying to exploit. Lots of love and congratulations if you survived this session. Bye-bye for now.